Hello YouTube, Jerry Kirkpatrick here, and today's episode of Quarantine Quickie version number 5 is on spacers. You can see the ones that I have that I use on a regular basis out front there. If you have a bead roller, especially a plate type bead roller, Harbor Freight, Eastwood, all of the places where you can get a just a plate type bead roller, you're going to be using dies other than what came with the machine. If you'll notice, if you take any of the stock dies that come with your bead roller, slide it onto the shaft, and you will notice that the die itself is slightly longer than the shaft. It's not slightly longer than the shaft. There is a recess, a smaller diameter, so the die slides up against the shoulder. That's what I meant. The distance from the shoulder to the end of the shaft is less than the back edge of the die to the front edge of the die. In other words, the die is going to be proud. It's going to be sticking out a little bit farther than the end of the shaft. And the purpose for that is, I know a lot of them come with the set screw, and that is to be tightened down on the flat that is provided with your bead roller, and then to help keep that die from turning, the flat washer and bolt that holds it on affords another degree, an amount of holding power to the shaft. Personally, I cut a keyway into the both top and bottom shaft of the bead roller, and then I weld a key onto each of my dies. In that way, I'm not reliant on the set screw. And also, the bolt arrangement that I use is only keeping the die all the way back against the shoulder, not doing anything about allowing the die to turn on the shaft. You'll notice that the shafts are turning in opposite directions, and no matter which way you go, right or left, one of those dies is going to want to rotate on the shaft in the direction that will loosen that bolt. So that's why I use the keys to alleviate that altogether. If you use a key, then no matter which way the shafts are turning, you won't have to worry about that either one of the bolts coming loose and then your die being able to slide around on the shaft. The next thing is, I doubt seriously that the only dies that you will ever use are the 3 sets of stepping dies, the 3 sets of beading dies, and the shearing dies are the only ones that you'll ever use on your bead roller. you saw a couple of videos back in Quarantine Quickie number 3, the variety of dies that I have and their thicknesses, and that is where the spacers will make or break the setup on your bead roller. If your bead roller is dead stock, just as you purchased it, the top shaft is stationary. The only way that you can line up a set of dies is by using these spacers that we're going to be walking through here. And I'll show you those over on the bead roller as soon as I get finished with this. If you have, well, many of you have purchased my my plans and modified your bead roller so that the top shaft does move back and forth. Yours, the spacers will be needed without a doubt, but you're not stuck to a specific size, a specific dimension to get the spacing and the die exactly correct. You can set it up pretty loose, loosen the bolt, slide the shaft to where it needs to be, tighten the shaft down, and you're off and running. The nice thing about having a movable shaft is, depending on the thickness of the material that you're working with the later cars in steel, you'll probably be using 19 gauge to make a repair panel. Earlier cars, you'll probably be using 16 gauge. No. 18 gauge, which is 049. And then for doing some of the heavier aluminum repair, you'll go all the way up to 06, depending on how much shape that you put into the piece. The lesser amount of shape that you put in a panel, the thicker it has to be to retain rigidity. So come in just a little bit closer and I'll show you what I got going on here on the table. So like I said, here is a stock die. This is one of those that came with my particular bead roller, and here you can see the variation of different dies that I have to use, and to retain that the distance for the die to be just slightly longer than the snout, the smaller diameter of the shaft, you're going to have to be using spacers of some type, either in front of or behind the die. And most of these dies, it's taken me almost 3 years to get a complete set of dies that will do everything that I need to do. I haven't made a die in probably 2 or 3 years, but it took 2 or 3 years by using different combinations, both top and bottom of the machine, to come up with all of these spacers. And the first ones that I made were made out of 3/4 inch pipe, just black pipe, that I drilled out to 7/8. That would that's the same diameter as the shaft. These later ones, there's only 3 or 4 of them. What I've started using, or what I use now, is 1 inch round 16 gauge 06 wall, and that obviously a 1/16 brings it down to the nominal shaft size. So let me get these all set up here. It's kind of hard at this angle to see what the progression is. These last two are just flat washers, so I didn't have to change anything. And this one is just slightly thicker than this one. I try to give myself like a 1/16 on a couple of them. There's a 32nd of an inch difference between any of the thicknesses. So let me get these off and you can get a good look at them. If you notice, sorry, I didn't mean to jump back, but if you notice, I have them numbered all the way down, and I also have the numbers written on them, and the only reason for that is because I'm a Virgo and only somewhat nuts. So, so here you can see all of the spacers that I have, and you'll notice that number 10 and 11 here, these two are almost identical in height, and I needed that to get a specific set of dies exactly where I wanted them. Between here and about here, you can see that the spacing is fairly broad here. In fact, those two are just about the same also, and on down there's only maybe a 1/16 of an inch between the height of any of these. And as I said, when you use different thicknesses of dies, both top and bottom, it's the spacers that will allow you to align the dies for different thicknesses of material. And I know your next question is you want the length of these. The only one that I'm going to give you the length of is this tallest one. And let's get over to the bead roller and you'll see exactly why that is the only dimension that you need to start with. The rest of them will be determined by the die set combinations that you will be using. Okay, so as I stated before, what you want is the total setup of your dies to be just slightly longer than this portion of the top shaft. If you take one of the original dies that came with your machine and slide it on there, you'll be able to feel the amount that you want the die sticking out over the end of the shaft. So for my first die, I just used one of the flat washers, which is the very thinnest die I would be using, and then just take and measure from that portion and give yourself a 1/16 of an inch or so more than whatever this dimension is, and that will be your first spacer. That's why I can't tell you what it will be, the length of your die to the end of the width of the die from the outside edge to the end of the shaft is what will determine the length of your longest spacer. And by having this, I can put that on I can have my flat washer all the way out at the end and still have engagement with the key. So that is how you will determine the length of your first spacer. And what you get with your machine is a bolt. Now I've turned the head off to so when I'm tipping, this won't be protruding out too far, and I won't come up and scar the material that I'm working with. And you'll also notice that I've made a much thicker washer. The ones that come with the machine is very flimsy, and it'll just bell. It just goes right in. What I use is a countersunk head bolt, and then I made brass fairly thick washers, countersunk, so I have a nice flush surface on the outside. And especially if you're using a die with a recess in it, that will go all the way in, then you can do your tipping all the way up flush to the piece. So if I wanted to use this particular die, I'd put on my first spacer. Now this is to get my die all the way to the outside. If I wanted to move this anywhere in, the length of this spacer would vary. Put that one on. Now I'm still not all the way out at the end, so I'm going to use a very thin spacer. Tighten that all the way up. Now my die is all the way at the end. It's tight. It cannot rotate, not only because the key is holding it, but this is forcing everything up against this shoulder. So you can see what a variation of spacers I use there. So if you have another die that's of a different width, you can control where it lands on the shaft. And then at the end, a very thin spacer. And now I'm out past the snout, out past the end of the shaft. A different thickness of die, and now I'm out past the end of the shaft. So by using different combinations of your spacers with different thicknesses of the dies, you can move the die, put your bottom die on first, and then by the thickness of the spacer you can control where the upper die is in relationship to the bottom die. If you have a top shaft that is movable, then you're not stuck as tightly to the spacer combinations that you'll use. So that's it. Thanks for watching. Give me a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe. See you later.